Well, hi, and welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. This week, we are covering part two of how do I clean and prep my data for analysis. If you missed part one, which we covered last week, which are the basics of preparing for data analysis, getting organized, you can find that on our YouTube channel at trustinsights.ai/YouTube. It is in the So What playlist. Today, in part two, we are covering the data itself. So we're going to be walking through an actual data set that Chris has been working on and sort of going through what to look for in your data set, what kinds of questions you should be asking, and based on how you got organized before you even pulled the data, what additional organizational steps you should be taking in order to set yourself up for success. So that's what we're covering today. Chris, John, anything else before we dive into the data? John's like, let's go.
Take it away. All right. So as you recall last week, one of the first steps in the process is figuring out what our goals are, right? What is it we're trying to prove? So I was actually writing a blog post about, someone was asking how we do social media strategy planning. And the first thing that came up to mind was, okay, well, we kind of need to know like what's working. So before we talk about data prep and data collection and some social media data, we got to ask ourselves, what should we be caring about? So a while ago, we ran some customer journey analyses. These are attribution models. This is on my personal website. I wanted to compare 2020 versus 2021, looking at social media. Now, obviously, Google and email, far and away, the things that drive a lot of conversion on my website. So we can give that a miss. But in 2020, Twitter was sort of, the fourth most useful source, followed by Medium, then Facebook, and then going down here, you have YouTube down the middle and LinkedIn. This, by the way, is why I stopped doing a daily YouTube show, because when we look at 2021, it's still, generating almost no conversion. So even though it's fun, it didn't really move the needle for conversion. What we saw in 2021 is, if you look, Twitter generated about 9 conversions in January of last year and 11 this year. So even though it is proportionally a smaller piece of the pie because email is doing so much better this year, it still is generating good conversions. Meanwhile, Facebook and LinkedIn are down in the middle of the pack. I'm like, well, this isn't really working for me. So the question that I had and the data I want to dig into is, well, okay, Twitter's at least doing something, right? It's in there. What could I be doing on Twitter that's better? How could I improve it? So, Katie, when you're facing a situation like this, and you look at data like this, what comes to mind? How do you start thinking about framing out the problem of how do I make my Twitter better?
How do I make my Twitter better? I like the alliteration. So the first thing I need to look at is what the heck am I currently doing? So because you want to take a snapshot of the current state, because in order to measure what you're doing better, you need to know what you're changing, and that gives you an opportunity to change one thing at a time. I think that's one of the mistakes that a lot of people make, that we've made historically, is trying to change too many things all at once. Then how you measure kind of gets away from you because you don't know what exactly it is that's working. So if you're looking specifically at your Twitter account, Chris, the first thing I would ask you is, how active are you on Twitter? How many times a day are you posting? Is it consistent? Is it random? Do you have a current plan that you could look at to say, okay, this is what I'm currently doing. Where in this could I be doing better? Have I measured my engagements? Am I growing consistently with followers? What are people doing? What things am I posting? What specific posts are actually converting? So there's a lot to dig into before you even try to start changing things.
Exactly. And so when we start talking about those questions, we're really talking about requirements gathering. What kinds of data do we need to be able to answer these questions? So when we go into the data, let's go ahead and pull the actually, let's pull up Twitter first. So when you go to your Twitter account, if you go to analytics.twitter.com, you can export all of the data that you see here. And what you get out of that is a pretty, okay, somewhat helpful spreadsheet. You have the ID of the tweet. You have the tweet link. You have what you said in the tweet. And you can see there's whole bunches of stuff in here. The time and the date. The number of impressions, which is a number, by the way, it does not show up in other social media monitoring tools. You have to get it directly from Twitter itself. Your engagements. your engagement rate, and then you have all of Twitter's appended data. So the number of retweets of that tweet, replies, likes, user profile clicks, URL clicks, so people who click the link in the tweet itself. Detail expands, so if there's a piece of media attached to the tweet, like a photo or a video, someone clicks on it to look at it in greater depth. Permalink clicks, app opens, app installs if you have app-based tweets, emails if someone's emailed a tweet. If there's a video attached, you can see the number of media views, the number of media engagements on it. And then if you've been paying for it, you get all the same data for paid. Now, here's the challenge I run into with this. And this is where we start getting into a data prep. There's a bunch of things that you just talked about, Katie, that aren't in here, right? So we have the tweets, but we don't really have a change in followers per se. We do have all the different types of engagement. We have the time, we have the impressions, but I want to know how to make Twitter convert better for me, right? So ultimately, the measure I'm going to have to go off of is URL clicks, because if I tweeted something like a link to my website, I want to know if you clicked on it, right? So that's sort of my objective. So one of the first things we have to figure out anytime we're looking at a data set is, what's our response variable? Like, what's the outcome that we're looking for? And if the outcome's not in here, you can't really do an analysis.
Well, and Chris, I know that one of the strategies that you employ is you actually tweet out, and we all do, a lot of third-party content, so content that isn't yours. So as you're going through this, would you need to exclude those tweets and only be looking at the tweets that go to your web properties?
It would be nice to do that. You can't do that, though, with this data, at least in its current form, because as folks who know who use Twitter, Twitter runs everything through its own link shorteners. So every link is going to be the t.co links in here. So that's something to keep in mind of stuff we'd want to engineer. But there's other stuff that we'd want to create as well that, again, Twitter doesn't include in the data set. We have to do what's called feature engineering. You have to take existing data and turn it into other kinds of data. So looking at the data, what things could we engineer that might help us understand, actually, that might be a factor that could boost, clicks versus not clicks?
One of the quote unquote easier things to feature engineer, and again, feature engineering is not something that should be scary and unapproachable. It really just means, taking your existing stuff and sort of picking it apart to smaller piles of information, at least in this context. So I would probably start with some of the date and time data, and break it down a little bit more granular, because I can look at the dates, but then I also then have to look at a calendar and say, what day of the week was that? Does that make a difference? Or what time of day was that? Does that make a difference? And if all of that data is contained in a string, then I would want to pull that out into individual pieces of data.
Yep. Other things that'd be pretty straightforward. How many handles have been mentioned? Like here, I've been at mentioning Ring Central. Here, I've mentioned our friend Jeremy Aoyang. This was a Twitter chat that was happening. Can I engineer out the number of hashtags used in a tweet? Absolutely. You can just do raw counts. How many hashtags were used in this? And that's something that we might be able to say. Does the number of hashtags used in a tweet helpfully predict the likelihood somebody clicks on that tweet? If you look at the syntax, any tweet that begins with an @ symbol is a reply. So we could code a tweet as to whether it's a reply or not and be able to differentiate that. And I think critically for a lot of social media managers who are struggling with their content strategy, the big question is, what content are you sharing? What content should you be sharing? So if we look at this list here, and this is just 1 month of tweets, I tweet a lot. So there's a lot of data to go through. And you can see there's different topics in here. We got, top 3 podcasts from marketing majors, AI algorithm using a heart rate and motion to predict age and gender, promotional tweets for Trust Insights on 2021 marketing plans. There's a lot of information in here. One of the things we want to do is we want to boil this down from text into numbers. So one of the steps that we would take to do this is to basically take all of the the copy of all the tweets and get a list of the number of words used, right? Which individual words have been used in those tweets. So let's show you an example of how that would look. Let's go here. So let's go ahead and take our tweets. We're going to bring them all into a big data frame. Now, this is in the programming language R. You don't need to use this. I use it because it's convenient. It's easier for me to process the data. You could do this in Excel and then with some third-party things on the web. But we're going to go here and take all those tweets. I'm just going to make a frequency list. And this frequency list is just the number of times any given word appears, right? So I use marketing 161 times in this pile of tweets. Use the word data 112 times. Insights, and obviously the company name Trusted Insights is in there. Analytics shows up 45 times. We see some of my You Ask, I Answer stuff. We have business. We have data science showing up, podcasting. And so this gives me a good starting point to try and figure out how many different topics are there that I'm tweeting about. And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and said, okay, I want to count how many times did I mention social media and all these different words in social media, like Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, etc. How many times did I mention SEO stuff? How many times did I mention data science, Trust Insights, podcasting, Google Analytics, and then entering how many, was there a URL in there, an @ handle, was it a reply, how many hashtags? And so this process is the data preparation process to go through and understand what are the things that I might want to predict on, what are the things that I might want to run an analysis on, and just even doing something as simple as getting raw counts. Like, oh, okay, I tweet about marketing way more than data. If I did that and did those counts, I could say, is that what I meant to do? Like, did I actually mean to be tweeting so much about marketing technology when I'd like to be known for data science? They're different things.
Let me ask you this question, Chris, and maybe it's just a matter of depending on what your goal is, but so you're looking at raw counts based on frequency of words used in the text of those tweets. Would you recommend that someone look at, a different metric first, like number of engagements or number of retweets, pull that information, and then look at what the context of those tweets were?
So that goes back to the original data science lifecycle, the data prep lifecycle, where we have to know what our strategy is. What method are we going to be using to judge this outcome? In this case, we've already selected URL clicks as our response variable, and we know we're going to be doing a regression analysis to say, okay, what things have the strongest mathematical relationship to this outcome we care about. If we didn't have that outcome, then yeah, you could actually do a whole bunch of mixing and matching and explore what are some other possibilities. It might turn out, for example, that if you were to do it either with, you could do it with a regression analysis. Engagements might matter a whole lot to URL clicks. We don't know yet. We haven't figured that out yet because we haven't run that part of the analysis. Right now, we're just trying to prepare the data so that it can be used in analysis. And that's sometimes it feels like you're putting the cart before the horse, but it's one of those things that's very iterative.
Well, and I think that, it goes back to your point of what we were talking about last week with that life cycle is one of the first things, Chris, you pointed out on this live stream was that I asked a bunch of questions that the data can't answer because that data does not exist in that data set. And so those are the types of things that you would want to sort of write down and figure out, what data do I need in order to answer those questions? Because if, I say, Chris, I want to know the number of followers month over month that we grew, and you hand me, the export from that Twitter, I'd say, I can't answer that question. And there's, that's then just sort of wasted time and wasted resources. There might be a different kind of data to look at or a different way to capture that information. So it really does, go back to all of the planning up front, which might feel daunting, is going to save you a lot of time, especially when you start getting into expensive resources who know how to use programming languages such as R. That's not an inexpensive ask.
It's definitely not. And the techniques that you need to do the analysis, in addition to the computational costs, you have the expertise costs. Because in order to run this particular model the way that I've set it up, you have to, if we'll just a quick scroll down here shows you just how much more goes into this before you actually get to the answer. This is not a small amount of coding and programming to pull this off. So there is absolutely a very large cost to not doing the prep work and then building a model and then finding out the model sucks, and then having to redo it over and over and over again.
So John, you don't actually use Twitter a lot. I know because I have access to your Twitter accounts. Because as the CEO, that's what I get to do, is I get to see everything. But if you were, just hypothetically for yourself, if you were to start tweeting more or setting up some sort of a strategy, what kinds of things would you particular want to be known for aside from, your partnership with Trust Insights?
Yeah, I think, the biggest, we always joke about the cobbler's kids have no shoes. The gap that I'm missing is there's all this marketing over coffee content, which could just be recycled every week. There's no reason the featured episode from 2 years ago just couldn't get plugged and fill that all up. So yeah, one of these days I'll get around to actually doing at least the baseline adequate marketing. And then after that, I don't know, the channel doesn't seem to fit that well because, LinkedIn and Facebook are a little bit better because they give better previews of podcast or of links that you're sharing. So, the content, it kind of falls to the bottom of the list. The other thing though, and this, I'd be interested in what you guys think about this, is that, is it worth going to the effort of really doing a drive to get more followers, to try and get in front of more people? Because that's always been a question. If I were to actually do a full-on press and campaign to see how much action I could just get happening in that channel, and it would feed upon itself. As you get more people, you start to publish more times per day. Is that would it be worthwhile to build that kind of flywheel?
It depends. It depends on a whole bunch of things. We know though that social networks in particular really do focus on engagement. Their algorithms are tuned towards getting eyeballs to be sticky. And so one of the challenges, and this is something that has come back to bite a lot of brands hard, is they spent enormous sums of money building huge followings, and then those followings were not engaged. And so it actually cratered their Facebook pages, Twitter, very similarly, because you can't have 10,000 followers and have one person engaged. You look terrible versus having 10 followers and one of them engaged. You got 10% engagement rate. And again, we don't know the back end scoring mechanism, but we can see through empirical evidence that the less engagement you have, the less well you do. So just on a basic campaign basis, I would say, no, you probably shouldn't be buying followers.
Yeah. And it's funny, because I noticed on Twitter, there was a tweet from Twitter that was being retweeted like crazy. And it just said, 4 likes is a lot. and when you think about it, among billions of tweets, yeah, actually, if you get 4 likes like that, you're doing well.
That's a really good point. And I think, that engagement piece, and that's something that we'll look into with this data, is important because it's not just about people liking it, but if someone asks a question and it goes ignored, do you have the time and availability to then be responding to people on Twitter to keep that conversation going on one single tweet or one thread? And so engagement is more than just someone clicking a like button. Like, you have to do work as well.
Exactly. So we're at a point now where we've prepared the data, I think probably as well as it's going to get, because we're now at a point where we don't know what we don't know, right? We know we've got this data, we've engineered, I think, a decent number of features out of it, but we're kind of stuck now as to what should we be doing next. So in terms of what to do next, if we go back to the life cycle, and try to pull this up here, probably should have had this up and running in the first place. Let's see, where is my data science lifecycle? Here we are. We've collected our data. We've taken a look at it to see what's in here, what dimensions are available, what metrics, what data types, right? And we've done some very initial analysis. So now we're kind of at the requirements gathering stage. We've actually had to do some feature engineering up front because we talked about it early on, but we know that in the initial data, some of the required features were simply not there. So the next thing to do in the process is just do a quick quality check, like how much data is the data in good condition or not. So let's go ahead and run this.
Well, and I think that's a good PSA. If you've only tweeted 3 times in the past month and you're looking at trying to do this kind of analysis, you probably don't have enough data. You have to have, there's no magic number, but if you've only tweeted 3 times, for example, like that's really not going to tell you a whole lot.
Exactly.
There's no magic number, but it's way bigger than 4.
It's bigger than 3, but it's not magic. Here I am. I'll be here all day talking, sample sizes.
Oh boy.
This is why you hang out with us, Chris.
Exactly. So this is a type of exploratory data analysis. This is just very simple univariate analysis to look at what's in the box, right? So we're taking our data and asking about what's in the box. There are some tweets here, for example, that have occurred more than a few times. They're on repeat, right? So we would want to know how much repetition is there in the data set. And there's actually a fair amount in here. We have our timestamps. We have our impressions. How many impressions? So we have a minimum number of 4. We have a median of 1,200 and a maximum of 14,000. That's a pretty wide range in terms of impressions. John, to your question about should you be focusing on building awareness? You might want to first just take a look at your data that exists and say, what is the range of reasonable impressions on the tweets that you're sharing? Same for engagements, right? Minimum 0, no surprise there. The median 6. And a maximum of 343. Now, bear in mind, this is on a Twitter account with 95,000 followers. 343 engagements is the maximum. Kind of sucks, right? It definitely goes to show that just because you have a lot of followers doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. Engagement rate, the median 0. Woo.
It makes all of us feel better, Chris.
Oh, yeah. Retweets, replies, and things like that, the likes. And then we start getting into the stuff that we started engineering. So looking at how often is it, talking about topic marketing, most of these topics have zeros, right? So they're not frequent. So there's not a lot in here. So that would make me start to question the predictive power of some of these topics. If there's not enough to even be, the median topic, then A, my Twitter feed is probably not as focused as it could be. But B, there might not be a lot of predictive power when we run an actual algorithm. We look at the number of times I use handles. One tweet, apparently I had 19 handle stuff in it. That must have been a fun tweet to read.
I've seen those come through. Those are yep. Intense.
Up to 5 hashtags and so on and so forth. So even just this very simple univariate analysis, just looking across the board at the data set, tells us a lot about what's in the data. The things that are not in here that I'm glad to see aren't in here are there's no missing data, right? So looking at this, there's no file, big piles of NAs. There's if you look in this column here, valid, you got all 100%, which is looking good. Makes me happy. If you had 20% missing, 30% missing, you probably can't go on a whole lot. Right? You're gonna get stuck because you've got big chunks of missing data, and at that point, you have to say, do we need to supplement the data? Do we need to do imputation to try and repair it? Do we exclude the missing data? What do we do with it? But in this case, because it's a clean data source, it came out nicely well ordered.
Question for you, Chris. So I often see a lot of people tweeting in different languages. They have keyboards that handle special characters that the standard, English-based keyboard doesn't have. Would that throw an error into your, the script that you just ran? Or are those things that you would have to account for ahead of time if, let's say, you were fluent in a different language and so you were constantly tweeting in both kinds of languages?
So that's actually a data engineering question. And the short answer, at least in the code that I'm writing, is that everything gets transliterated down to the ASCII character set. So you would want to change character sets for your tweets. So if you use UTF-8, UTF-16, something that will accommodate that, and then the code would then function exactly the same. But you would need to know that going into it. So if you were doing this on, say, a customer service data set where there's the possibility you don't know what languages are in there, then you'd want to probably use something like UTF-8 or UTF-16 to make it as maximally permissible as possible for all the different languages. One of which, UTF-8 is UTF-8 MB4 is one of the formats that is an extended multi-byte character set that accommodates emoji. If you use standard UTF-8, emoji don't work. They come in as these weird strings of characters. You have to use that other character set. And again, knowing you're looking at social media data, that might be something you want to plug in here. Now, we're looking at my tweets. I don't use emoji in tweets, so we're okay there.
But if someone were mentioning you, they might.
Exactly. If I was looking at social media monitoring data from like Talkwalker, for example, then I'm like, I need to use a different character set. And again, that's an engineering question.
Well, it's an engineering question, but it also goes back to prepping your data for analysis. Things that you should probably be aware of if you're looking at social media data. There is likely to be an emoji or two thrown in there.
Exactly. So we've asked questions of the data set. We've obviously dug around, looked at the raw data itself, and seen what comes in the box. And we even started doing some of the preparations for analysis, engineering new fields, doing quality checks and things like that. Katie, what's coming up next week in this topic?
Next week, we are actually, looking at, is the data ready for more heavy-duty machine learning? What do we need to do to get the data to that predictive space, to do more of that sentiment analysis, for example? That you can do some of that out of the box, but it's not as good as if you're doing more heavy-duty machine learning. Chris, you had mentioned predictive power, those kinds of things. What is it that you need to do to get your data ready for those things?
Yep. One of the things that you have to do to know when to, I don't know if I'm phrasing that correctly or not, is you've got to be able to at least run some quick tests on the data to see if what you've got to work with is even useful. And this is part of that requirements verification stage, but it's also part of modeling and insight. So like I said, I was working on this data for a blog post, and I've got two different results here of basically how good is the data at answering the question I wanted to answer. And there's two different fields here. On this one is one set of parameters for testing. This is another set. And I'm looking at the root mean squared error, which a lower number is better. It means that the data is less noisy. And then the R squared error range, which again, closer to 1 is better because it means that the data fits better. So far, just looking at these initial results from an initial test model run, they kind of suck. The root mean squared error is good. I mean, it's a pretty low number, but the R squared error is way below 1, which means that the data doesn't really answer the question. Right? I asked it, what explains URL clicks? And of all the stuff that we've put in so far, none of it's a particularly good fit. Now, there's two things we could do at this point. Number one is we have to question, and this goes back to our goal and strategy, are we using the right algorithm? We may not be. And two, if this isn't the case, if we're pretty confident in the algorithm, then we have to ask ourselves, are we missing some data? Is there some data that is not in here? Like, for example, you were pointing out earlier, followers change or a number of followers that would assist the model in building a prediction about this. Right now, these numbers are so low, I would not put this in front of a client. I would say, what, this needs some more work in the lab, because neither of these results would be acceptable enough to say, yes, bet your strategy on these results.
Well, the R square, if that gets above 0.5, would you go with that, or you need it to be all the way up to 1?
I would be looking for above 0.5 more than anything, though, because one of the things I can show you what the actual files look like. There's all these different variations, so I'd run probably 35 or 40 different variations of all the ways to test the data, and then look at the cohort of them and find, okay, do any of these parameters show up as a solid test. And you can see I've done 6 unit tests so far. None of them are reaching the finish line yet.
And that's all with the same data set.
All the same data set. It's at this point, it's called hyperparameter optimization. It's like easiest way to explain it is you've got the same ingredients. Now you're tweaking all the dials on the oven to see different temperature, how long you cook it for, and stuff like that to try and make a good batch of cookies. So far, I've made 6 batches of bricks.
Well, and this goes back to sort of the point of this particular episode is what questions should you be asking when you have the data? And so the first question I'm going to ask you, Chris, is, are you looking at the right data to answer the question? It sounds like you're not.
Yeah, something's missing. Or it may turn out that URL clicks is just the wrong thing to be optimizing on. Now, from a logic and common sense perspective, there's really only a couple of things that you could in Twitter data that you could optimize on. One of which would be, the engagements, the impressions, or the clicks. Essentially, sort of the actions that people take. To validate that, you would actually have to set up a different experiment. So you want to take the Twitter data to your website, and then the different numbers inside Twitter, and do a regression analysis on that to say, okay, what number most closely looks like Twitter traffic, and then use that as a benchmark. Knowing how I tweet and knowing what I'm doing with my data, I'm fairly confident that, in fact, URL clicks is the correct objective for this particular test, but it could be something we could test and see if there's a different possibility. What I think is the bigger problem is that most of my tweets that have URLs go to the Trust Insights website and stuff, and so that test would fail essentially because I'd be benchmarking off my personal website when I should be using the Trust Insights website as the regression analysis.
Okay, so let me see if there's a way to simplify this a little bit, because we've talked a lot about regression analysis. We've talked a lot about cleaning the data, feature engineering, bringing it into a system like R. What if someone doesn't have access to those things or doesn't have that skill set? What are some of the things that they could do with, obviously anybody can export that data from analytics.twitter.com. What could they do with just that spreadsheet to try to answer some of these questions? Of course, going into the analysis, knowing this is what I have available to me. We covered in last week's episode, what tools do you have? And if the only tool you have is Excel, what can they do with that?
Some of the basic feature engineering, you could do this inside of Excel. So you can see here, I'm looking for specific words. If I go back into our Excel spreadsheet, I'll just add a column here. That was a much bigger column than I expected it to be. And then I could create, for example, let's go to the top. Let's call this marketing. I can do equals count if in this cell. And it's basically going to give me a count of the number of times marketing appears in that cell. Right. And so I could repeat this column by column for all those different topics and engineer the features in here. Mm-hmm. And then I could do, using Excel's built-in correlation function, I could do a sort of accurate version of the multiple regression model in Excel. I don't know if you can do multivariate as easily as you can in R or not, but you could at least identify, column by column. Okay, yeah, there's at least something here. So you could do 60% of this in Excel. Mm-hmm. I think it is way easier to use either R or a platform like Watson Studio, if you or SPSS, or Alteryx, any of the bigger, more expensive BI tools. If you've got access to those, even like the free public versions of them, you could certainly do that type of analysis. Like Watson Studio, you get 50 hours free a month, so you don't have to buy anything from IBM in order to be able to try it out on a data set like this.
Which I think that's really good news for people who are short on budget and resources. But I think that it's important, Chris, as you've pointed out, you've run 6 different tests, and the data set isn't necessarily answering the question. So it sounds like you still need to do all of that prep up front before you bring it to the machine learning models, because you could be wasting a lot of those free hours that you have on data that's not going to answer the question.
Yep, exactly. That's why you should sign up for multiple accounts.
Well, let's not talk about gaming the system. Let's stay focused on this.
Yes. No, doing requirements gathering, doing that initial analysis, doing feature engineering, trying to come up with as many options as possible on the first run through is important, right? The more that you can do that, the easier it's going to be to actually run those models, because you still have to do all the tuning and stuff in the model itself. You want to make sure the data going into the model is as good as it's going to get. For example, you could look for the syntax around, like, is this a Twitter chat I was participating in? Yes or no, and then code that as well. Maybe Twitter chats work or they don't. Yeah. But it's important to be able to dig into those questions up front as much as you can and create as much of that engineered data as possible. It's not easy, but it is something that is an important skill.
Well, and to your point, if you're being asked what should we be doing with our social media this year, and the company is looking to hand over a lot of money to invest in social media, you want to make sure that you can answer that question with some data behind it, because come the end of the year, when nothing's changed and nothing's happened, you're going to be SOL.
Exactly. So you have to do the analysis up front.
I'll be doing a lot of work on LinkedIn.
Well done. Well done.
On that note, so coming up next week, we're going to be doing the more advanced feature engineering, if appropriate, and then taking a look at what it looks like to take out some of the features. So we want to talk about cleaning and taking out stuff that doesn't matter, because we didn't cover that in today's episode, and there's a lot of junk in here too that needs to come out. So that'll be in next week's episode.
Yep, that'll be part 3, and then part 4, we get to the meat of it. The so what? We've done all this work. So what? What do we do with it? What do we do with all this data? Did we answer the question? How do we put it all together? So stay tuned for those, the following 2 Thursdays, 1 p.m. Eastern, same bat time, same bat channel.
We'll talk to you next time. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, and our weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.